Hello, and welcome to the Leadership Series from the Indiana Department of Education. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the presentation Revealing the Reading Brain. My name is Tara Boone, and I am a secondary literacy and language arts specialist here at the Indiana Department of Education, and I am excited to introduce to you our presenter, Michelle Elia.
Hi, everybody. Okay, well, I guess I should probably kick this off a little bit by telling you who I am and how I ended up here hanging out with you all in Indiana. Welcome to Revealing the Reading Brain. My name is Michelle Elia, and my day job is I work as one of two Ohio literacy leads for the Ohio Department of Education. And in that job, I get to talk about the science of reading and literacy 24/7. It's a wonderful job. And whenever I have any spare time, I virtually travel the country presenting on the science of reading, presenting in multiple states. And it's a really exciting place to be right now, learning more about the research that we affectionately refer to as reading science. So I'm super excited to have you all here with me today. I'll share my contact information at the end. I'd be happy to chat with you all more as we dig deeper into this. And I know that I shared a Padlet that I'm sure someone will put into the chat for you so that you can access any of the resources that I mentioned today. They are all linked in the Padlet. But for the sake of time, let's get this party started. Okay, so here's my my cautionary tale before we get started. I would like for you to follow the advice of Adam Grant and think like a scientist. And thinking like a scientist involves more than just reacting with an open mind. It means being actively open-minded. It requires searching for reasons why we might be wrong, not for reasons why we must be right, and revising our views based on what we have learned. Because some of this information might be very new to you. It might be different than the way that you have taught reading or learned to teach reading. That's okay. It was new for me not too long ago. This was very challenging for me to wrap my head around a very different way of teaching reading. So as we go forward, please think like a scientist and we'll go through this and learn together. I also welcome any of your comments in the chat. I really do like to hear from you all, and I will spend some time at the end answering questions. So what are we going to do in the next hour? We are going to examine the reading process within the brain. And I should probably have made that the plural processes because there's multiple things happening in the brain when we read. I'm going to debunk some myths using neuroscience, and I'm going to apply the science of reading, specifically neuroscience, to your classroom practices. So to start, I have a question, and obviously you're not going to be able to answer in a poll, but I just want you to answer to yourself quickly, think out loud here. And if you'd like to type this in any sort of comment, I'm happy to have it, but otherwise just think out loud. If a child is surrounded by spoken language, will they learn to talk? If you're in the room with someone, turn to them and tell them yes or no. If a child is surrounded by language, will they learn to talk? And the correct answer to that one is yes. 99% of kids, if immersed in a culture of language, will learn to speak. Speaking is a relatively natural process for our brain. We are biologically wired to do it. So we learn to talk just by being immersed in a culture of language. Now, next question. If a child is surrounded by books, so having that print-rich environment, will they learn to read? Again, I'll give you a second. Turn to someone who happens to be near you, even if it is someone who is not listening to this webinar, just to mess with them. Tell them, if a child's surrounded by books, will they learn to read? Yes or no? And the correct answer there is dun, dun, dun. No. Simply immersing children in a culture and an environment of wonderful books is not enough to teach children to read. Dun, dun, dun. And that's part of the crux for this entire presentation going forward, really. And that is this idea that the brain is not wired to read naturally. We need to train the brain to read. In fact, if as a teacher you have taught a kiddo to read, you get to change your resume. You are officially a neurosurgeon. You have changed the brain. I like to think of myself as a neurosurgeon. I'm not going to lie. I think that's kind of cool. So reading is not a natural task, and children are not biologically prepared to do this by evolution, unlike spoken language acquisition. And I think this is really important to recognize. So who I'm quoting here is Stanislas Dehaene, who is a neuroscientist in France, and he has really led a lot of research into how reading is acquired in the brain and the processes in the brain involved in reading. He's published multiple books on the topic, and he's got multiple videos, including some of the ones that I've shared in the Padlet today. But I think as teachers, we need to know that reading is not natural. Reading isn't something we can just immerse kids in and they'll pick it up naturally. For most children, we have to explicitly teach the process of reading. And in order for reading to happen, I love this last line, massive changes are needed at the phonological, that's going to be huge, and the visual level before children master the skill of reading. So again, if you have taught a child to read, you have changed their brain. You have absolutely altered their neurology of their brain. And that's really important to recognize as we move forward. So one of the other things you need to know is that students learn to read from speech to print. So once again, I'm going to ask you to say this out loud. I know that that sounds cheesy in a webinar, but those who are doing the talking are the ones doing the learning. So I need you to say out loud, students learn to read from speech to print, and say it like you mean it. I can't hear you, but I have to trust you. And that is absolutely critical to learning to read. We need to build on what is natural in the brain, which is speaking. The talking part, remember, that's what we develop naturally. And we need to build on that and connect it and anchor. Pinker says we got to bolt it to the print in order to have really great readers. So let's take a look at where speech acquisition happens in the brain. So we see multiple regions here indicated in yellow where we are analyzing the phonology or the sounds in our language. And this is happening through immersion in speech and then developing our language. So as our children are from infants starting to develop oral language, or even other forms of communication, because this is not limited only to oral language, whatever mode of communication they may use, they are activating regions in the brain that are connected to phonology. And when I talk about phonology, I'm talking about the sounds. So this part is very natural for our students in that they are developing their knowledge of the sounds and words from birth simply by being immersed into a culture of language and speech. Now, there is one subcomponent of this phonology or the sounds that our kids are not going to acquire naturally, and that is the ability to take those sounds down to the individual phoneme level. That's something that we have to do and help our students with. We have to teach that, and that's why we teach phonemic awareness, which is one of the big five, right? So we teach phonemic awareness and to help them to take those sounds, which they are aware of quite naturally from their environment, and break them down into the individual phonemes, those words. So dog, d, g, and break it down to phonemes. So eventually they can bolt those phonemes onto the print. But remember, these yellow regions are going to start to develop actually before birth, quite naturally, simply by being immersed in a culture of language. But now let's talk about the other regions in the brain involved in reading. And not all of these develop quite as naturally. So here you'll see in green the access to meaning. And that also develops through exposure to language. And as our children are exposed to more and more language, they're going to, as babies and toddlers and preschoolers, they're going to attach meaning to all of these different words. They're going to develop background knowledge and context. And that's going to grow those green regions. But I want to talk to you about this spot way back here in the red, and that's called the visual word form area. And I'm going to ask you to repeat that, visual word form area. Go ahead. Now, the visual word form area is also referred to as the brain's letterbox. And I'll ask you to say that as well. The part in red there, the visual word form area, is affectionately referred to as the brain's letterbox. Can you say that for me? The brain's. Wonderful. So the brain's letterbox is one part of the brain that does not develop naturally at all. In fact, I'm going to switch over to my document camera here for a second so that you can kind of see how this happens in the brain. So here you'll notice I've got a little brain. We're going to draw on it. And I want to kind of break this down to you. What happens every time we read a word? So back here, along the border of the occipital and the temporal lobe, we see the brain's letterbox. And the brain's letterbox is responsible for recognizing the print in words, the orthography or the letters in our words. And this part of the brain is not at all hardwired to do this. In fact, from birth, this part of the brain reads faces. From birth, this part of the brain is responsible for recognizing the faces of caregivers, of those in the child's environment. But as our children are exposed to print, so this is where teaching makes us neurosurgeons. As our children are exposed to print and taught, oh, well, this is the letter A, and this is the lowercase a, and here's our letter B. And as we point out print in the environment, this letterbox, it shifts. And it changes from recognizing faces to now recognizing print, which is a really, really powerful thing. It recognizes the orthography or the letters in our words. And then I'm going to oversimplify what happens in the brain here. So the signal comes in through the eyes. It goes all the way back here to the brains. What was that word again? That's right. The letterbox. It goes all the way back to the brain's letterbox. And then Stanislaw Dehaene says we see an explosion into the left temporal and frontal lobes. And I want to stress to you the idea that this all happens on the left side of the brain. What side of the brain does this happen on, everyone? The left. I know you're all thinking right now, I am talking to a YouTube video, but participation is key to learning and retaining this, right? So the signal comes in through the eyes. It goes back here to the brain's letterbox. And then there's this explosion into the temporal and the frontal lobes, the temporal, parietal, and frontal lobes on the left side of the brain. Now, what happens in this explosion? Well, I'm going to kind of show you in a slightly more sophisticated way. So we start by looking at those letters back here. And as this explosion happens, first we connect to the sounds, which are way up here predominantly in the brain. Although you'll notice we see storage of sounds in multiple regions on the brain in the frontal, temporal, and parietal lobe. You'll see multiple connections to sounds. But first, the first thing that this signal travels to, and it travels through dendrites, right? Those little fingers coming off of the neurons. It connects to the sounds in the front of the brain. And I'm just going to oversimplify it by putting the sounds up here. And then after those letters connect to the sounds and we bolt them together, then my brain connects to the meaning parts of the brain, which are predominantly here in the temporal lobe. Although, like I said, they're also happening up here in the frontal lobe as well, but they're predominantly here in the temporal. I'm going to oversimplify it, and I'm just going to shade this whole region here. And this is where we're going to connect to the meaning of those words and the context or use and background of those words as we're reading them. Now, remember, in order to develop this, our kids have to have first oral language. They have to have been exposed to and immersed in a culture of language and words, because we read from speech to print, and this meaning and context for those words is developed through our oral language. And then eventually we're going to connect it to the print once we learn the code. So I'm just going to kind of check in to make sure we're still doing okay here and everyone is, I don't see any pressing questions coming through. Okay, so let's review this one more time on my, I'm going to take you back to my document here. So the signal comes in through the eyes. It goes all the way back to the letterbox. And then the signal has to get all the way up here to connect to those sounds. And it does that by following this superhighway to connect to the sounds. And it kind of takes that superhighway. Some folks call it the phonological highway, but it's this connection between the letters and the sounds. And once our kids do this enough, they become proficient readers, right? And so we make this connection to the sounds. And once we connect to sounds, then we're going to connect to the meaning and the context for our words. But in order for all this to happen, I have to teach, because this connection between letters and sounds doesn't happen automatically. I have to teach that connection. I have to teach that highway. And then I also have to teach them to connect that to their oral language and their knowledge of the words that they know. So you can kind of see that reading isn't really a visual process. It's a very sophisticated process that begins with recognizing the letters and the words, connecting them then to the sounds, and then connecting them to the meaning. And I'm going to ask one more time, what side of the brain does this happen on? Feel free to say it out loud or tell someone who happens to be sitting next to you. What side of the brain are we seeing this on? It's on the left. Now, this is really important. All of this happens on the left side of the brain in good readers. But what Stanislaw Dehaene and his co-workers found when they looked at the brains of struggling readers, they found that the left side didn't light up. In fact, in struggling readers, they found that our students who were struggling, and this is not just neuroscientists, multiple researchers, Sally Shaywitz. I mean, like we've got so many, Marilyn Yeager Adams work that have talked about this. Our struggling readers, we find compensatory attempts to read where the right side of their brain lights up. Now, good readers read on the left. Struggling readers try to compensate and read on the right. Now, the good news is we can change the brain, because as teachers, we're neurosurgeons, right? So we can change the brain. And if our students are struggling readers and the right side of their brain is lighting up, we can teach them explicitly and systematically so that we can build those connections in the left side of the brain that our strong readers have and light up the left, which is what we want. We want to light up the left side of the brain to make for good readers. So I really love this quote. And I'm not going to lie, this former teacher of the year was not talking about literacy, but when I saw this quote, I thought he should have been, because he said, teaching is brain surgery without breaking the skin. It should not be entered into lightly, nor performed by amateurs. And I think that this is really important to recognize, because all of this good reading that we see lighting up the left, that happens through great instruction. But unfortunately, sometimes our instruction unintentionally can light up the right side of the brain and create struggling readers. So I'm going to continue on to talk to you about what we need to do when we teach as well to make sure that we light up the left and we don't light up the right. Because unfortunately, our instruction can cause struggling readers unintentionally. Now, if you want to know where I got some of my information from and you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend this video from Stanislaw Dehaene. It's called The Brain Prize Presents, and I've linked it in the Padlet for you so that you can access it. I don't have time to play it today, but I would love for you to take a look at it, because I think that Stanislaw Dehaene is a genius. I mean, after all, he is a neuroscientist, right? And I'm going to summarize some of the important points that were in this video for you, though, just to save you all a little bit of time. Here we go. So one of the first things is that we know that learning to speak is natural, but learning to read is not. Simple immersion into quality text does not make a good reader. Reading has to be taught. And when we teach reading, we have to teach the way the brain learns to read, right? So teachers need to know how the brain works to teach reading effectively. And so let's talk about that. I want you to take your left hand. I want you to make the letter Y with your left hand. And I'm going to review those regions of the brain with you here. So as we're looking at our brain, let me get over here for you. As we're looking at our brain, the signal comes in through the eyes. It goes all the way back here to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe goes, oh, those are letters, and immediately transfers to the letter box. Take your thumb, put it behind your left ear. There's your letter box. That's where we read the letters. So the signal comes in through here. My brain goes, oh, those are letters, and immediately transitions the signal to the brain's letter box. So there's the letter box. But then we've got to get the signal to come to the front of the brain where we process sounds. Show me sounds. Show me letters. Show me sounds. Show me letters. So we've got to get this signal to go across the left side of the brain all the way to up here where we're processing so many of those sounds. And again, I know this is an oversimplification, but work with me here. So we need to make this connection through the brain into the sounds, right? We've got to build this connection from letters to sound. Teachers need to know this. We have to teach the letters and connect them to sounds to make good readers. And then last but not least, we connect to the meaning. So knowing that order makes us, ensures that we teach in such a way to light up the left side of the brain and not the right. Every time we teach a kid to read, we change the brain, including a process that Stanislaw Dehaene refers to as neurorecycling. So what is neurorecycling? Neurorecycling is repurposing a part of the brain for a new purpose. So we're like recycling it to do something different. For example, the letterbox back here. So remember that Y. There's my letterbox. Sounds or letters, sounds, letters, sounds. So my letterbox back here was originally wired to read faces. We neurorecycle it to now read the letters. Kind of cool, right? So as teachers, we need to know how to teach in such a way to light up the left, because otherwise, sometimes our instruction can accidentally and unintentionally light up the right. Things like having our students look at pictures and guess, or telling them to look and memorize the whole shape of a word, or telling them to look at the first letter and guess based on context. Those kinds of things can light up the right side of the brain and actually do harm to some of the developing brains of our readers. Okay. So as we talk about these 4 regions in the brain, hopefully you guys, I'm going to just give you a really quick quiz, and I'm going to have to trust that you are answering these. The signal comes in through the eyes and immediately goes where first? Tell someone near you, where does the signal go? Hopefully you're indicating it goes back here to the occipital lobe, to the brain's letterbox. And then the signal is going to travel to connect to phonology, which we see happening throughout this left temporal and frontal lobe, specifically up here in the frontal lobe. And then last but not least, the signal connects to the temporal lobe, to all of those areas associated with meaning. And as our readers become more proficient, what we find is the connection between phonology and meaning kind of happens almost at the same time. But as they're learning to read, we connect first to phonology and then to meaning. It's not until they become fluent that the connection between phonology and meaning happens very similarly at the same time. So this is the graphic that Stanislaw Dehaene created that I've tried to demonstrate as best I could for you, that really shows all this complexity when involved in the reading process. But I also think it's helpful to see this happening as we read a word in real time. So this is a very small clip from a video from Stanislaw Dehaene showing how when we read a word, this signal unpacks throughout the left side of the brain. Remember, this happens on the left
side, the folds. And now I want to show you the activation of the brain as you read one word. We see it in time. So let me start this. Here we go. And you have the word unfolding from the back of the brain to the front of the brain. It will loop several times. You can see the information enters into the occipital pole, which is the visual side of the brain, moves into the...
So yes, I know that was a very abrupt ending, but I was trying to take 30 seconds from a very long lecture about the reading brain. Don't worry, I linked that long lecture for you in the Padlet if you would like to learn more. I also linked another resource in the Padlet, which is a full, about an hour and a half presentation I did for the Ohio Department of Education called The Reading Brain. Feel free to check that out. Hear some of this information again and kind of dig a little bit deeper into it. So here are some things that we know now from researchers, from neuroscientists like Stanislaw Dehaene and Bruce McCandless. When we read, we recognize the letters. And we look at those letters and we combine them to form graphemes. So let me explain to you what I mean by that. I'm going to kind of take you back to my document camera here. I try to warn you this so you don't get webinar whiplash with that quick switching. So for example, if the brain takes in this word, and in my letterbox, we take in this word, what my brain will do is it will say, well, CH, they're going to put those 2 letters together and connect it to ch. AR, put those 2 letters together. That's a grapheme. And we're going to connect it to the sound R at the front. So letters to sounds, letters to sounds. And then this GE, we're going to put those together. That's a grapheme. It's going to represent the sound J. And our brain is going to do this automatically. Now, granted, in order for this to happen, we need to teach it to do this, which is why that systematic explicit phonics instruction is so critical for teaching kids to read, because that's how we get this to happen in the brain. And this is what happens in the brain of our good readers, right? So we want to teach in a way that works for the developing reading brain. So we connect these graphemes to the speech sounds, also referred to as the phonemes, to decode the word. And then we connect to the meaning systems in the brain, which are in that temporal lobe right here, in order to recognize, like, did I read that right? And also that word charge, like, what are all the different meanings I know for that word charge, and how is it being used here, right? So these areas, when it comes to meaning and context, we use these same parts of our brain for speech, for spoken language, so meaning and phonology. We use those same parts for spoken language as we do for written language. It's really powerful. We're just neuro recycling them now to process the written language, whereas before they were really focused on oral language. But the good news is, because we learn to read from speech to print, as we develop oral language skills, we're actually developing the reading brain as well and making for better readers, which is why we want to encourage our little babies to babble and talk and make noises. And as our children are in preschool, I love to visit preschools. I love to talk to the kids about all the things that they're doing in their centers and play, because we know when we build that language in our kids, they're going to be better readers later. So reading is really about creating this connection between the visual, and I'm going to say the orthographic, and the spoken language systems, because really we're connecting these letters to these sounds in order to teach kids to read. And this causes significant changes in the brain. For example, the connection between these multiple areas of the brain, between this visual word form area and the letterbox to these phonological areas, this connection is not there. We have to build that through our grade instruction. So if you built those connections, you're a neurosurgeon. You have changed the brain of your children. So I want to talk a little bit about this connection. So here's my oversimplified version, right, of the brain that we've been talking about. There's this pathway that we want to build to connect the letters to the sounds. We need to build this pathway to connect the letters to the sounds. And this does not happen automatically. It has to be taught. And the more repetitions our kids get, the better and more automatic this pathway becomes, so that the signals just transfer between letters and sounds very quickly and efficiently. So here you see it on my simplified brain. Here you see it on the more a complex version, but we're connecting the letters to the sounds, and we have to build that pathway in our kids. So you might be asking, but wait a minute, what about visual memory? I thought that visual memory played a role in reading. And here's a myth I want to debunk for you. Visual memory does not play a role in reading. Orthographic memory, or our ability to recognize letter strings. So when you look at a word, give you a word here. Well, we'll take the word charge. When you look at the word charge, if I spelled it like this, you would look at that and say, that doesn't look right. That's orthographic memory. And orthographic memory is built by this connection between letters and sounds in our brain. But visual memory does play a role. And the visual memory plays a role in one really important thing, and that is in the recognition of the letters of the alphabet. So visual memory is incredibly important for letter recognition. So let's kind of unpack that a little bit here. What is the role of visual memory in learning to read? So we use visual memory, we tap into it to learn the shapes of the letters, but we don't use visual memory to learn the shapes of words. So here's where I'm going to break some hearts just a little bit. And remember, we're thinking like scientists here. So I don't want to break your hearts too much, but remember how we used to do this? We have to be actively open-minded. Remember, and I used to do this. We used to take things like this, and we would try to get kids to memorize the shape of that whole word. We now know that that's not how my students learn to memorize the words. We learn the words by connecting the letters to the sounds, right? But visual memory is critical for learning the letters. So the shapes of those letters is really important, and that is entirely a visual process. So that means that letter reversals are actually a really common thing in the brain, and they're pretty natural. And I'm going to explain to you why letter reversals are so stinking natural for our kids. Because remember, this is the part of the brain that used to read faces, right? So right here, the brain's letter box used to read faces, and a face, my face, is the same whether it's this way or this way or this way, or if I stood on my head, I'd still be the same person. I'm Michelle now, still Michelle, and Michelle now, right? But letters don't work that way. Letters are a little bit different. So this marker, still a marker, still a marker, still a marker. But let's take a look at this. Here we have the letter D, right? What is it now? It's a P. What is it now? Q. What is it now? It's a B. So letters, when they change their orientation, the entire letter changes, which is why letter reversals are so common. They're not a cause. They don't mean dyslexia. They just are a common error that needs to be taught, because our children learn from a very young age that this highlighter is still the same highlighter no matter how it's oriented. But unfortunately, letters don't quite work that way. When you change their orientation, you change the entire letter. So letter reversals, common. Don't get too hung up on it. We just have to teach our kids more, give them more repetitions to develop that letter box. One of the things that are super helpful for building up that letter recognition and for reading in general is handwriting, as well as multimodal visual motor instruction for letter recognition. So maybe tracing the letters. I like to do the air or sky writing, where you lock your arm, hold two fingers out, and draw the letters. So if we draw the letter H, we start at the top, come down to the bottom, and then up and over. Those kind of multimodal instruction is super helpful for kids. It helps with handwriting. It also helps with that letter recognition, and to avoid those reversals. And the motor sequence in handwriting really does matter. So when we teach handwriting, we are teaching to the brain. We are developing that letter box, but we're also strengthening this parietal lobe as we are teaching the motor sequence for handwriting. So handwriting is super important. So I have a poll question for you. When we read, do we process the written language as whole words or letter by letter? Turn to someone next to you and tell them what you think the answer is. When we read as good readers, do we process the written language as whole words or letter by letter? And the correct answer is, dun, dun, dun. I know the suspense is killing you. We process letter by letter. In other words, we take in and we notice each and every letter. We process each and every letter as we read the text. This is how we notice the difference between blink and blank, the, then, than, thought, throat, house, horse. It's how we notice the subtle differences in the words. Our brain processes each and every letter and every word that we read. And then those letters are stored to represent the sounds in our language. And I know that this might be causing some cognitive dissonance, but remember, we're thinking like scientists here. So I want to make sure that we're doing that. Someone said that lately they've heard it may not be best practice to teach letter names and letter sounds. You know, there's a lot of conflicting information coming out. Here's what we know. Kids need to know the letter names and kids need to know the letter sounds. And they are both absolutely important. So when I train preschool teachers, I train them to teach the letter names, the letter sounds, the letter shape, to have them write the letters, sand trace the letters, write it in shaving cream, all the above, right? Because we know that all three of them are absolutely critical. Our kids need to know the names and the sounds in order to be good readers. Beyond the predictive validity of letter naming and knowing the letter names, it does go away after middle of the year, first grade. So as we have like older struggling readers, the sounds become the most important part. But for our younger readers, we want to teach absolutely both. So great question. Thank you very much, Donna. I appreciate that. Okay, so I love this quote, simple quote, Deb Glazier. She's a genius. But in one little quote, she summed up the entire process I've spent 34 minutes talking to you about, which is when we see a word in print, what we see kicks the reading process into action. The letters, every letter, are interpreted as sound, and the sounds of the words stimulate the meaning. So we go from letters to sounds, and then we connect to the meaning, all in this left side of the brain in that explosion. And don't take my word for it. Take the words of Stanislaw Dehaene, of others, David Kilpatrick. I showed you Deb Glazier. We know from multiple researchers, skilled readers perceive every letter in words. Contrary to the claims of a popular email, or maybe you saw it on Facebook, that when words were spelled a different way, it was supposedly a study out of Columbia. By the way, no such study exists. Our brains take in each and every letter in words. That's how we can differentiate words that are spelled very similarly, because we take in each and every one of those letters. We also now have Keith Rayner's eye tracking research, where we're able to see how our brain takes in each and every letter in words. So it's been proven beyond any shade of doubt that skillful readers process each and every word and letter of those words as they read the text. But this also helps to debunk a myth that we used to think, which was that sight word vocabulary was based on this visual memorization of whole words. And that is not the case. Sight word vocabulary is not based on visual memory or visual skills. It's actually based on the connection of the letters to the sounds. So let me give you a little analogy to help with that. So here I have a letterbox, right? And so remember, the letterbox back here is where we take in each and every one of those letters. And then we eventually take the signal and connect it to the sounds. But an amazing thing happens once we strengthen this pathway in the brain. We make it automatic and we strengthen this pathway. Words get stored for automatic retrieval in that letterbox. So when a student sees a word, they just go, house, think, thought, and they just read the word. Well, how do we get them stored in there? Well, I want you to think about a mailbox. So if you've ever gone to the post office to put something in the mail, like maybe you forgot to put a stamp on it. Once you put it in there and close it up, if you forget to put the stamp, can you get your hand in there and pull that letter back out? Nope. It's in there. And that's what happens in the letterbox in our brain. Once we have connected the sounds to the letters, it gets stored in there. It's in there forever. And it becomes a sight word that is permanent to our brain that we cannot unlearn. So how do we get sight words? Well, we have to take the orthography, the letters. We have to connect them to the phonology, the sounds. And when we do that and we build that pathway over and over and over in the brain, they get stored in the letterbox and they become a sight word. And I always joke, every word wants to grow up to be a sight word someday. So the brain stores words that are spelled regularly and irregularly in the exact same way. In our letterbox, we connect the letters or the orthography to the phonology, the sounds, and we get it into the letterbox. And that is how it is absolutely stored. So we don't learn to read some words differently than others. All words are stored in the same way, connecting the letters to the sounds. So that's the way we want to teach it. Okay, you get to play along now. You're going to tell me myth or fact. Well, maybe you're not going to tell me because I can't hear you, but you're going to tell somebody, whether they want to hear it or not. Here we go. When we read, the brain processes each and every letter in a word. Myth or fact? That is a fact. Now, this one, I didn't quite tell you this, but I will tell you a fun story for this one. So neuroscientists do not debate how to teach children to read, since they know what happens in the brains of good versus poor readers. Myth or fact? This is a fact. In fact, Stanislaw Dehaene recently at the Plain Talk About Learning conference, he presented to a room full of thousands of people. He was streaming from France, and he said, amongst neuroscientists, there are no reading wars. That's only amongst educators. Within neuroscience, we know how the brain reads. We know how reading is developed, so we don't have reading wars, which I thought was a really powerful statement. Because when we trust neuroscience, we know how to teach kids to read. Okay, next one. We store words based on visual memory. Visual memory, true or false, or myth or fact? Hopefully right now you are all saying that is a Myth. That is absolutely a myth. And then teaching students to memorize whole words can actually hurt the developing reading brain in some students by lighting up the right side of the brain. Now this, remember how I said that sometimes unintentionally our instruction can hurt our developing readers? This is absolutely a fact. So good readers read on the left side of the brain. And we want to teach in such a way that helps them to take in each and every letter, connect the letters to sounds, connect to oral language, right? But if we teach students to memorize whole words, we can actually light up the right side of the brain in some of our kids, which we are therefore developing poor readers. And that's the last thing we want to do. Last statement. The brain processes meaning first, and then the letters and sounds when reading. Myth or fact? Hopefully I've taught you well, and you are all saying myth. That is absolutely a myth. We know the brain takes in the letters first, connects the letters to the sounds, and then last connects to the meaning. Unless, of course, we are already proficient readers, in which case that phonology and connection to meaning happened very, very closely because we've built up this great sight word vocabulary. We've stored those words as sight words by connecting them to phonology and developing that pathway. Excellent job. So to store sight words, make the connection between the sounds and the letters first. And even the rule breakers will follow the rules, follow some of the rules, but make sure we make that connection for our kids. So how do we do that? Well, we do that by mapping phonemes to graphemes. And I'm going to kind of give you an example under my document camera here of how we do that. And so we want to teach phoneme grapheme mapping to make those connections between the letters and sounds. And when we do this, we're going to do this for words that are spelled regularly, so they follow the rules, or irregularly, they do not. And what our kids need to have to do this is they need to have phonemic awareness skills, and they also need to have some phonic skills. So they need to have some knowledge of the code, which is why having a good, explicit, systematic phonics program is so critical for building great readers. But when we do this and we develop this connection between letters and sounds for our kids through repetition and practice, we are going to build their sight word vocabulary. So phoneme grapheme mapping looks something like this. I might say to my students, the word we're going to learn is look. Tell me the sounds you hear. O, k. And then we're going to connect that to the letters. O, k. And whether the word is spelled regularly or irregularly, we store it the exact same way. So even a word like, let's see here. Let's do have, where I might have to learn to read this word by heart because part of this word doesn't follow the rules. And this part is the part that sometimes trips people up because there's this E here. By the way, there is a rule for that. And once I teach my kids those rules, they know it. And the rule is words can't end in V. I, J, Q, U, V at the end of a word, they cannot be. Thank you, Lynn Stone, for that because she's fabulous. Words can't end in V. So this E is here to protect the V. So it's really important that our kids know those kinds of rules. But whether a word spelled regularly or irregularly, we store it the same way, connecting the letters to the sounds. So here I have an example, the word thought. So I could take this word, break it up into the sound boxes to represent each sound. Ought. I might say to my students, how do I spell the ah sound in this word? That's right, O-U-G-H, but that's the part we need to know by heart. How do I spell the th sound? That's right, T-H. This is why we have to have a good phonics scope and sequence so we can teach all of these patterns because the brain loves patterns. But we also want to help our kids to recognize that some parts don't follow the rules. Those are the parts we need to know by heart. And some folks call that a heart word routine. I always say, I don't care if you use a heart, a star, or a cupcake. What I care about is that our students recognize that those letters, even though they might not follow typical patterns, are representing one sound because that's how it's going to be stored in the brain. Now, to help you with this, there's some cute videos on the really great reading website called Heart Word Magic. You could recognize or you can tap into those to kind of help you with this. They're cute videos to reinforce with your kids after you've taught phoneme grapheme mapping. You could use sheets like this for older kids to teach phoneme grapheme mapping, or you could use ones with the bigger squares that I had under my document camera. I'm going to show you another way to do phoneme grapheme mapping here called Tap It, Map It, Graph It, Zap It. And this comes from my friend Judy Dodson in her book 50 Nifty. I apologize for my allergies there. So I'm going to take you through this steps here. Here we go. So I'm going to start by taking a word and I'm going to tap the sounds. So let's take the word would, as in she would like something to eat for a snack. I'm going to start by tapping the sounds. W, d. There are 3 sounds. Let's map it. W, d. And then we're going to graph it. So let's talk about the letters that represent that sound, those sounds. W. That's the letter W. I'm going to go to the last sound next. D, d, d. That's the letter D. And then I have this sound. This is the part I have to know by heart because I spell this sound O-U-L. How do I spell the sound? O-U-L. And then I can have my students use their magic wand and they can zap it, would, as they read it from left to right. I also like to make my students rewrite the word and say the sounds. W, d, as they rewrite it. So that is a very, very quick lesson in Tap It, Map It, Graph It, Zap It. There are lots of wonderful videos using this strategy online, but also you can check out that book because I know that it's all listed there. Okay. Why am I telling you this? Because until we properly understand how to promote permanent word storage, we will continue to have many weak readers. So we need to know how the brain stores those words. So when a student encounters a word that they do not know when reading a text, what do you say to them? Now, this would be a lovely time to pause and talk to a friend of yours. But for the sake of time, I'm going to tell you what you should say. What you should tell the students to do is what the brain does. Look at all the letters because that's what good brains do. Sound it out. What sounds do those letters spell? So we want to connect letters to sounds. And then, is that a word you know? Does it make sense here? That's the last question we ask. We want our brains to do that which good readers do, which is look at all the letters and connect them to the sounds. So I want you to think about this statement. Do you agree or disagree with this? And tell me why. We'll tell someone next to you why. It is critical that we establish instruction that assists learners in becoming truly fluent readers rather than just fast ones. This comes from the esteemed Jan Hasbrook, Dr. Jan Hasbrook, who's written multiple books and articles about fluency. So do you agree or disagree with this statement? It is critical that we establish instruction that assists learners in becoming truly fluent readers rather than just fast ones. Well, I have to tell you, I absolutely agree with this particular statement. But in order to do that, we have to build this pathway between the letters and the sounds. And that tells us we might have to provide a lot of repetition for some kids. So here's what we know. Struggling readers may not have developed this pathway between the letters and the sounds. And in order to get them there, we need to provide additional repetition, which I'm going to warn you, it's slow. It's laborious, but slow and steady is how we build the pathway. So speed doesn't develop by teaching kids to guess. Speed develops by giving kids more practice. Practice, practice, practice. What's the old saying? How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. So don't skip that slow, laborious phase. Don't skip that sounding out phase. Don't skip that additional practice with how to sound out words. That's how we build this pathway that leads to automaticity and fluency. And there's different things that we can do to kind of help our kids get there. So phoneme grapheme mapping, which is what I showed you, is one thing. We can also practice fluency with words that look alike. So can, cap, cat, cab, focusing kids on looking at each individual letter, sounding it out. We can also do repeated readings with decodable texts. And I linked some wonderful decodable texts for you as well. But don't skip that slow and laborious phase. Some students will automatize words in few repetitions, 1 to 6 repetitions. Other students will need 30 to 40, 50, 100, depending on the reader. So be sure to give them those repetitions they need to develop this pathway, but don't rush it, because otherwise we'll light up the right and not the left. Because decoding is the first step that gets us to fluency, and then fluency gets us to comprehension. Fluency is the link from decoding to comprehension, but you can't force the fluency. You don't want fast readers. You want readers who automatically have developed that sight word recognition. So speed develops with practice, not through rushing our kids through the phases. And as we teach these particular skills, what we're actually teaching is, it's actually called orthographic mapping. We don't teach orthographic mapping, but orthographic mapping is what happens in the brain as we teach kids to connect letters to sounds and then connect it to the meaning from their oral language. This process that then happens automatically in their brains is called orthographic mapping, which develops fluency, because that's how the words get stored in the letterbox. Take the letters, map them to the sounds, they get stored in the letterbox. And so when those words are stored, that's called orthographic mapping, which is what happens in the brain. Now, what about those fun read alouds? Do they have a place in instruction? And my response is absolutely. They are critical for building oral language and language comprehension skills. So those are absolutely critical for our instruction. In fact, we know a large set of the brain on the left hemisphere is activated when we read aloud just as much as when we listen to reading. So as we read aloud, we are developing the phonological and the meaning centers of the brain every time we read aloud to kids. We're also starting to build this pathway for our kiddos. So we want to read aloud to kids. We want to wash them in waves of words, to quote my friend Judy Dodson. Some children come to school with too little language to support comprehension. Wash them in waves of words through read alouds, text sets, rich oral language. Give them the language and background knowledge they need to develop those meaning regions in the brain that also builds their phonology. So wash them in waves of words will make for better decoders, but also better comprehenders as they have background knowledge and language to connect to. Okay, so I've got another activity for you. So washing them in waves and word builds vocabulary and builds background knowledge. So learning to read like learning to talk. Is it a natural process? That myth or fact? Learning to read like learning to talk is a natural process. Myth or fact? That is a myth. Systematic and explicit phonics instruction is beneficial for all students and harmful for no students. That's a fact. We know that all students benefit from phonics instruction that is explicit, teacher-directed, systematic, following a scope and sequence. There are some students who, yes, will learn to read without it, but those kids don't come to us with little labels on their foreheads. And we know that phonics is beneficial for all kids. It's harmful for none. Okay, students need reading strategies like guessing words based on the first letter and looking at the illustrations. Hopefully by now you know that that is a myth. And read alouds are a powerful tool to build listening comprehension in the brain, which can contribute to reading comprehension. We just talked about that. That is a fact. And last but not least, increasing students' spoken vocabularies can improve reading comprehension. I'll say it again. Wash them in waves of words. That is absolutely a fact. Okay, friends, I'm nearing the end of my time and I want to give you some time to ask questions. So let's just debrief what we've learned in this 55 minutes. We've learned the parts of the brain involved in reading. We've learned the role of fluency and automaticity. We got to trudge through that slow and laborious decoding phase to build that automaticity, build this pathway between the letters and the sounds. We have to build that through good instruction. And sometimes that means trudging through with additional repetitions. It's slow and it's hard, but imagine how hard it is for our babies. We talked about how to learn sight words according to how the brain reads. Take letters, map them to sounds. That stores them in the letterbox. And last but not least, we talked about the role of phonology and the importance of read-alouds, because we know read-alouds wash our babies in waves of words. I'll leave you with one final resource. And that is a presentation I did. It's 3 hours for the OPEP conference. My audience was originally supposed to be paraprofessionals. And then I found out that I was going to have administrators and teachers. So it's called Reading Rocket Science and the Role of Paraprofessionals. But it turns out it's really a presentation for all educators who teach kids to read. It's a little long, but if you'd like to access it, I linked it in the Padlet for you. So once again, my name is Michelle Elia. Like I said, I'm the one of 2 Ohio literacy leads for the Ohio Department of Education. And I also do a lot of literacy consulting all over the country. And I'm really excited that you all invited me to come and hang out with you today. I thank you for joining me. And if you have some questions, I'd love for you to put them into the comment section so I can respond for you. What phonics programs are strong? Kristen, there are so many amazing phonics programs out there. The key is it has to be explicit and systematic, following a scope and sequence. One of my favorite resources, and I will put it in the Padlet, is Wiley Blevins wrote a great book called A Fresh Look at Phonics, but he has a wonderful article for administrators with the look-fors for a good phonics program. I don't want to say on here, like, this is a good, this is bad, but I will give you the look-fors. And those are in that article. I'll put them in the Padlet for you from Wiley Blevins. I'll also share with you the Reading League's rubric. The Reading League is an amazing not-for-profit organization completely devoted to the science of reading. They're wonderful. And they've created some great rubrics to evaluate your programs for the look-fors and the things you don't want to see that are like, yikes, red flags. So take a look at those resources. I'll put them both in the Padlet for you. Hopefully that'll help you out. Oh, I'm so glad Kristen said she bought the book, Fresh Look at Phonics. I love that book. I use it in the graduate course I teach at Walsh University. Thanks, everyone. Oh, tier 2 and tier 3 intervention. So Jamie, that's a great question. So I don't suggest 1 or 2 programs because it really depends on the kids. So what we know from MTSS is it's based on what the needs of the student are. We know that when it comes to literacy, a little more than 90% of our students who struggle in decoding. Some of them struggle in both decoding and in language comprehension, things like vocabulary, background knowledge, sentence structure. But more than 90% of our kids who struggle to read struggle with decoding. But I don't know that until I first get some really good data through a good universal screener and some informal diagnostic data. And that's going to help me drill down to figure that out. And then I can kind of determine what interventions I should be using with those kids. But it's really going to depend on the skill. What I want to tell you is you want to look for interventions that focus on specific skills and then gather the right data to determine how to teach those skills. And if you send me an email, I'll be happy to share some things that I've used and I know are wonderful. But really, it's about assessing skills first to determine where their areas of weakness are that we need to teach.
All right. I just want to thank Michelle so much for presenting for us. We really appreciate this. And it looks like you have one more question if you've got time to do it. Before I stop talking, I'm going to really quickly tell everyone that we have more presentations scheduled related to the Science of Reading framework. Our next presentation will be Thursday, April 28th. So if, like me, you learned so much from Michelle today and want to keep learning, make sure you tune in again on the 28th. Thank you.
And I will tell you that Columbia study, it never happened. It's not a real study. It's one of those viral emails that took off, but there was no truth to it. Such a study never happened. And we know from Keith Rayner, we know from neuroscientists like DeHaan and McCandless that our brain processes each and every letter of in the text, in the words that we read, we take them all in. So, and even as you read that viral email, you'll notice that your brain automatically notices each misspelling because we take in each and every letter. That's why we notice all those misspellings. So, yeah.
So interesting. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you everyone that is viewing either live or on demand. We want to make sure you get credit for being here today.